Welcome to my channel and to part 2 of this painting demonstration. We're working from a photo reference. If you haven't watched part 1, you see that plainly on the easel. The colors today are cadmium yellow light, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and titanium white. These are traditional oils made by Gamblin, using a Maybeth easel. This is a full box easel set up in my home studio. And from the last video, we concluded with basically the block in and a little bit of extra work on the sky. And now, as you can see, I'm going back into the painting and reestablishing darks with a mixture of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. One of the topics I'm covering in today's demonstration is the development of a daily painting practice. We talked a little bit about that in the last video, along with the topic of when you simply don't feel like painting and how to overcome that. And part of doing that is by establishing a daily pattern of painting, so that way, regardless of how you feel, whether you're essentially motivated to paint or not, that you continue to do so. The only way you're really going to get better at painting is by the practice of painting. It certainly helps to watch a lot of videos, read a lot of books, study composition, but nothing can replace the value of actually putting out your paints and continuing to build time at the canvas and on working on your easel. So for many of us, and I suppose that I'm talking to the majority that would be watching a video like this, you're not a professional, you are a hobbyist. You are trying to gain some skills, and most likely you are juggling a full-time job as well as trying to give some time to the craft of painting that you enjoy and love. And part of that time is dedicated to painting, reading, looking at art, etc. It can be very hard, though, to find time to set aside for actually painting. In many videos, and perhaps you also enjoy plein air painting, which is painting outdoors, you will have heard a lot of artists talk about the fact that one of the best ways to learn is to paint from real life, and I would certainly agree. The problem comes in is that most of us do not have the luxury of painting every day, especially if it's outdoors, and especially if you live in certain places where painting outdoors would be challenging given your work schedule, etc. And one thing I would encourage you to do, if that is the case for you, is to try to paint outdoors once a week on one of your 2 days that you have off, or the 1 day that you have off per week, and then concentrate on painting in your home studio the other days. The other practice I talked about in the part 1, just to summarize, I keep a folder of reference photos that I have personally taken. Do not get into the habit of using other people's photos. That can cause difficulties down the road if that material may be copyrighted, and I don't believe it's really worth paying money to some site that gives you the opportunity to use copyrighted reference works for painting. So I just would stay away from that. Use your own reference photos, do your own scout work. So this is one of the photos I took at Jeff City in Missouri, or Jefferson City, Missouri. This is the Osage River. I was attracted to the scene because of the composition. I suppose you could call this an O composition. In other words, you're basically going in one big circle around the painting. You're entering it and going around to the shoreline and back around. So what we call an O composition, according to Edgar Payne and his wonderful book on painting composition. Didn't feel like painting this particular day, and yet I found enough to occupy myself and continue to make strokes until I felt much more motivated in this second part after I got through the block in. Well, anyway, getting back to the folder. So I keep a folder of these reference pictures. I just print them off on standard paper using a personal inkjet printer, which does a pretty good job of rendering it. I'm not, a couple of caveats here. I'm not using this photo for the colors. I'm remembering the scene, and when I took this picture, I also am well aware that the darker parts of this picture and the lighter parts of this picture are just unreliable for the colors. It's best to take these reference photos, make some notes about the particular color adjustments that you might want to remember when you're doing a painting from them. But primarily what I'm using these for is the composition. I sort of know what I want to do and will change sometimes the colors of a scene and even arrange things a little bit differently. I'm not very concerned about trying to paint high realism. Now, there are degrees of realism, and as it turns out, I think this painting is fairly realistic in when I conclude it, but that's up to you to decide that, I suppose. And I categorize them in the file, so there are particular reference photos I've taken that are of water or of the sky or trees or architectural structures, and then I will look through a particular section and pick out one that interests me on that particular day and put it up on the easel like this and paint that scene. In that way, I'm not trying to create enthusiasm when there isn't any. In other words, I remember that this is work to become a better painter. I'm not trying to create a masterpiece here. And actually, that's how I approach all my paintings, and would encourage you to do the same, is always approach the painting as if it was simply a study. And if it turns out great and you could sell the work, or you can want to hold on to it as one of your better works, that's wonderful. And if it doesn't, there's no harm done. You've practiced, you've done what you needed to do to become a better painter, and the painting itself doesn't need to live on unless it's particularly good. And even among the best artists, they will tell you that there are many paintings that you never see them put up for sale because they don't believe it meets their standard. And so the same goes for any level artist. We all have works that we're proud of and works that we're not so proud of. Now, looking back on my painting career so far, which is not long, even a few years ago, there were certain paintings I was really proud of and others that I weren't. And if you probably took the whole stack of what I did a few years ago and asked me how many of these are you proud of now, I would probably say none. And that's a good thing, because I feel like I have advanced and become a much better painter in the last couple of years. And so the artwork from previous years is not at the level that it is now. And you will discover the same thing as you continue to work on your daily practice. Now here what I've done is I've gone back, I've reestablished my darks with a mixture of the ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson. Now I am looking at my edges and softening the edges. In most landscapes, you don't have a lot of hard edges. You're not dealing with architectural structures that are going to be that really need to have straight lines to be able to read correctly in a painting. In landscape mode, you're really trying to soften a lot of the edges so that it takes on a more natural look to the shapes. And notice that there were big shapes. I'm continuing to paint around the canvas, not in just one small section. I like to block in everything, and then now in this video we're going back through and basically adding another layer, another dimension of interest by fine-tuning shapes within the bigger shapes that we established in the block-in stage. By the way, this is a good opportunity right now to remind you, if you like the content of these videos, please subscribe to the channel. I could really use the help. And also give us a thumbs up, make a comment, or express a question that you might have. I do read all the comments that are submitted. Now, of course, if you're going to be overly critical, if you are a spammer, you're not going to get those comments printed. But those of you that are taking this seriously and would like to learn more information or pass along a comment or two, by all means, please do so. Sorry about that. Once in a while, I'm stepping back from the easel to get a view of what I've painted, and then invariably I'm running into the camera that's on the tripod recording this event. Here I've mixed up a little bit of burnt umber with some titanium white and a little bit of cadmium yellow light to establish a little bit darker shade for the bank of the river. Continue to work on of course, when you're doing water, remember that pulling your strokes downward in one direction helps create the illusion of light bouncing off of the surface of that, as opposed to the tree structures, which are going in various different directions. By creating strokes that only go in one direction for your water, it creates a contrast, which is pleasing to the eye and gives a sense of things being reflected back off of that surface from the sky. Here I'm producing what we might call a warm white. This is titanium white with a little bit of the cad yellow light, which kind of creates a color that I believe would be very close to Naples yellow. But now I'm seeing that color is, I didn't read it correctly. I'm adding some alizarin crimson into this to give it a little bit more of a orangey, pinkish tone, and sort of checking it with the photo reference just a little bit, even though I'm not overly concerned about matching that exactly. I just want to warm it up a little bit with some red. And now just applying that to see how that looks on the canvas. And now on the video it's reading a little bit lighter than it seemed to me in real life when I was doing it. Now I'm going to vary some of these brush strokes, bring some of this color around. Once again, why these little dots? And well, they most likely there's things growing different spots different color reflections happening in the foreground. I don't really want you to focus too much on the foreground though, so those shapes are really designed to help with the composition of bringing you around in a circle, like I talked about before, and keeping you in the painting and looking at different details and aspects of the painting, and to try to hold your attention for as long as possible. Just variating a few of the strokes there in the bottom. With these are hog bristle brushes, flats that I'm using. I predominantly used a number 6 for most of the painting. And then for some of the detail work, I used a liner brush, an Aspen liner brush from Princeton. The hog bristle brushes, by the way, are also by Princeton. They're the Ashley line. Now here is the main focus. I was very caught and interested in these couple of tree branches and trunks that we see in this mass of trees here. And so that's what I'm doing, is establishing a few of those marks to get our eye focused on moving into that space, and then around as your eye naturally goes further into the picture towards where the river bends around these grouping of trees, and you see a little bit of a lighter green in the background there, drawing you back into it. Now, obviously, you make mistakes as you go along sometimes and need to correct them. And one of the branches, the one focal one, it's a little bit too plump, if you will, on the sides. And one way you can deal with that is basically you'll take a paintbrush and you can sort of erase it. Or if you don't want to do that, you get the same mixture of the dark, which was Alizarin Crimson and Ultramarine Blue, and then paint into that lighter color to make that trunk a little bit thinner and a little bit more believable, because it's at some distance, and you can see in the reference photo it's not that wide. So you'll see that happen a little bit later, I guess, in this painting. Here I'm just adding a few just little touches to give you the sense that there's maybe some foliage growing on the side of this bank. And there's also some kind of a log or a shallow spot where some of the earth is poking up over there, and that little spot that you see with these lighter colors, it actually in the lake, that's what that is. And now I'm just adding a few more little branches in that space to draw your eye. This is the primary focal point. I will draw another tree later on. It was in my sketch. I kind of covered it up to the left of the painting surface. And you see it in the reference photo there. And what I like about that tree is that it provides some depth because it's closer to the viewer, of course, and everything else is a little bit farther away, so it kind of sets the context. And at the same time, it's not so bold that it causes you to focus in on it. It kind of sneaks up on you, and you realize, oh, there's a tree there, and then it helps you to move into the picture more, to focus on some of the other tree shapes that are fairly far back. Now here's what I'm talking about. I'm taking the liner brush, the Aspen liner brush, and basically painting back into the sides of that branch trunk and adjusting it with the dark color. And that's one nice thing about oils, is that they're very forgiving. You can paint wet into wet, which is what I'm obviously doing there, to correct some things if you don't like them. One of the other things to mention at this point is that it is so important to don't get bogged down in the details and continue to paint all around the canvas at once. It's what we call alla prima painting, which is in one sitting. I really prefer to paint like that in the studio. It really helps also with this daily practice is to try to paint as quickly as you can. Most of my paintings, whether they be in plein air, outdoors, or in the studio, I allot about 2.5 hours. At least paintings this size. This is only 11 by 14. I think that's a good size, especially if you're practicing. It's not super small. It's big enough to allow you to get a little bit of a flow of your brush strokes and so forth, and at the same time have the accomplishment of having a completed painting by the time that you're done. Here, just checking that light colors. I'm going to go and add some highlights now, adding a little touch of the titanium white. As you can tell, I use a minimum palette of colors, just using one for each of the primaries. I do add burnt umber on my palette. It's helpful to be able to have a brown to dull down some of the other colors for convenience as well. You could just use your primaries and mix all three of those colors together. Of course, it's going to give you a brown, but burnt umber, another thing I like about using burnt umber is that it has a relatively quick dry time. And so if you are using that in several of your mixes, it can help with that. I don't know about you, but I get anxious. I would like to be able to have my painting dry to the touch as quick as possible, especially when I'm trying to sell the works. It always makes it nice not to have to wait a ton of time for those layers to dry up, and that way I can put a retouch varnish or a Gamvar varnish is what I use from Gamblin to protect the painting as I ship it to folks who are purchasing it. Oh, good question. Okay, maybe you didn't ask this question, but some people may be interested in the art that you see on this channel. I do have a website. It's davidwpoe.org. And from there, you get a little bit more information about me. I have a gallery of my past works and current works. There's also a link there. I basically sell most of my artwork at this point in time on eBay. And you may be asking, well, why do you just sell on eBay? Are you trying to get into galleries and everything else? No, I'm really not trying to get into galleries at this time. One of the things I'm trying to do is simply work on my craft and become much better before I want to present myself to the galleries. I want to have a body of work. I want to feel that I can consistently produce really good work. And I also like the ability to call my own shots. In other words, set my own prices, sell as I wish, and have total control of that. And I don't want to be one of those artists that started asking for too much for paintings that was unrealistic and then being disappointed when none of my stuff sells. I would much rather sell low and continue to sell than to price myself too high at this stage in my development. And that might be helpful to you to know as you think about your own hobby. Maybe you don't have any interest in selling your work. You're just doing this to give as gifts or to pass the time and that kind of thing, which is great. There's no problem with that either. But pricing your work, I've always been told that the best way to do that is do it by the size of the finished painting. So if it's 11 by 14, you're going to charge per square inch. And if you are a new artist, you may decide that you're going to start at 50 cents per square inch or $1 per square inch and then work your way up. Most artists will increase their rates once a year, usually not more than once a year. And that's sort of an acknowledgement that you've been painting for an additional year. You're growing in terms of your artistic abilities and therefore demanding a little bit more money for your finished pieces. And of course, sometimes it's a matter of seeing what the market is going to bring you in terms of your artistic wares. Entering competitions, participating in plein air festivals, etc., can also give you an idea of how to price your work or how competent you are as a painter as you look around and make comparisons between your ability level and the ability level of others, and how much they're selling their work for. If they're selling their work, going to those events can be very beneficial for you. And also, as we continue to talk about the theme of developing a daily practice, one of the motivators for that can be to put on your calendar a plein air competition. One that's local, I would suggest. Of course, one that you can actually participate in. There are invitationals only. Those are for top artists in the United States and oftentimes in the world. Most of us are not going to be in that category. But there are many local events, and there's new ones popping up all the time, which allow for amateurs and hobbyists like ourselves to participate and to gain experience. If they are invitationals, oftentimes they will have a quick paint event, and you could also just sign up for that one event, the quick paint, and get some experience in that. Setting that on the calendar and knowing that you want to do the best job that you can possibly do can be a motivating factor in your daily painting practice. So that way you can set that date on the calendar, continue to build towards it, so that when you get to the event, you will feel more confident in your ability level and know that you've really practiced and are ready to try to do your best. Who knows, maybe even surprise yourself by getting an honorable mention or a prize for your painting in that plein air competition. Something to add to your website and to your list of awards and recognitions to promote yourself. Now here you notice I've been working on the clouds and the sky portion of the painting. Wasn't happy with it. I did some experimenting with pink in the first video, and you saw me go back over it. And I left it in the video because it's a good teaching point that with oil painting, it is really, really forgiving. And so as long as you keep the paint layers relatively thin, you can go back over them with a little bit thicker paint and with a little bit of medium and cover those spots up that you didn't care for, or use a palette knife and scrape those sections and redo it. I didn't scrape anything off at this point. I just decided to use some of those colors and leave them underneath as a kind of a new underneath painting. And then I'm going in over top of everything now with much thicker paint. So I basically gave up on this. I was not happy with the clouds. I wasn't happy with the pinks that I put in there, and felt that it needed to be blue. It needed to be more like the reference photo colors instead of trying to do something creative with different colors. Especially because the painting took on a little bit more of a realistic feel or impressionistic feel to me, and the colors just didn't seem to work well. in the sky. So, and you will have that happen from time to time as you're painting, of course, and need to make some major adjustments. And the nice thing to know about oils is that, like here, you can see I'm just going right in over top. It's not a problem. I don't have to panic. I don't have to throw the whole canvas away. I can go over top of it with a little bit thicker paint, and you'll never know the difference. And although you can't see it, even though I made mistakes and put different colors underneath there, I'm allowing little specks of that to shine through so that it will provide a little bit more depth to the color in the sky. Skies are not simply flat colors. In other words, just blue and putting a little bit more blue in as you go upwards. They have color to them. Some are pinkish, some are gray, some are greenish. I mean, it's amazing the number of colors that you can actually see in the sky, depending on the time of day, your location, what's happening in the weather, you name it. And then, of course, those colors get reflected back onto the landscape. So for a little bit here of this video, I'm continuing to work on that sky. I'm relatively happy with the shapes I've put in the foreground and in the middle ground at this point. Here I'm just showing you that I'm adding a little bit of the ultramarine blue to create a darker blue that will be closer to the top of the painting to reflect the fact that as you move up, obviously the color becomes more saturated. And there I'm removing some of those last clouds. I'm going to use a couple of the existing cloud shapes and leave them in the painting, as you see here. I always love Constable, who seem to always have an interesting sky. And so I like to have some drama in my skies, even if it's just a few simple clouds and a few tonal adjustments of color. I think that adds so much. Here I'm just doing a little blending with my number 4 or number 6 flat so that there's a gentle increase in the saturation color as you move up in the painting. One of the things that the daily practice will also help you with, especially if you enjoy landscape painting, and a limited palette, is that you will be forced to mix your greens and to really work on subtle shifts of color. You'll notice in this particular painting there's lots of greens here. It's almost basically a black and white, but with one difference, that you're just using various tones of green. And notice that on this limited palette, we're only using 2 colors primarily to get that, the cad yellow light and the ultramarine blue, and then little bitty doses of the alizarin crimson and the burnt umber to shift those slightly. Here I'm just going over these cloud masses so that they stand out a little bit more, and I'm consciously thinking about making these shapes stand out more, a little bit more bright, because of their relationship to the darker blue behind them. And at this point, I can tell I'm so much, at least I think this is so much better than the other colors I was trying to force into the landscape here. So it's clearly looking more like the reference photo now than it did in the first film or until this point. And that's what I mean by sometimes when you lay down your colors, you just really can't tell how a particular color is going to work until it's up and against the other colors that you have in the painting. And of course, you can achieve more harmony by simply using a limited palette and adjusting the different ratios of your mixtures to provide some nuance in a scene, whether that be a landscape or figurative drawings or so forth. And as you can tell, one of the things I'm noticing now as I'm making some of these color adjustments is that there's a lot of orange in this painting, which is good and helpful. One of the reasons why I was drawn to the reference is that orange gives a lot of life to the greens. It complements the greens very well because of red being at the heart of the orange mixture, correct? And of course, red and green help provide when they're painted next to each other, help provide more focus. And so in just a few minutes, I think this is the part of the video in which you'll see me mixing that, and then I'm going to be putting in a little bit of a shoreline with that orangish brown red mixture. Now here, all along, I'm painting wherever I can. I wanted to soften the lines that I had in this grouping of trees to make it a little bit more believable and to emulate what I am seeing in the reference photo. Now it's not exact and I'm not fussing over it, but I'm certainly being influenced by what the photo is showing me at this point. And now I'm coming back in and doing the same small adjustments of shape, form, and texture with this other grouping of trees. And I'm consciously thinking about this side of the picture where that tree is going to go as a kind of buffer in this foreground. I want the greens to be a little darker to emphasize the shadow that we're seeing on that side of the photo, but at the same time make sure that it's clearly being read as vegetation and not shadows or something else. Let me know in the comment section below what are some of the things that you have found healthy for you and helpful for you in terms of a daily painting practice. What are some things that you strive to do? I do know some artists will actually take just, a canvas, divide it into fourths or something to do little sketches. I've known other artists that do basically your color squares, practicing what colors you can make with the various mixtures given the colors you keep on your palette all the time. I've never felt that those are very helpful for me. I like to get right in there and paint some scene, and so most of my practices are actually paintings. In fact, as I may have mentioned in the first video, I find it very helpful to remind myself that every time I pick up the paintbrush and start painting a painting, that it's just a study. Now, if I like it, if days afterwards I say this is one of my best works, then obviously it gets elevated. It's no longer a study. It's something that I may want to keep or sell at some point. But that takes the pressure off of me. I'm not thinking about making a masterpiece every time I pick up the paintbrush. I'm thinking about enjoying the process, working on certain new information that I've learned, and attempting to problem solve basically as the painting progresses. So you see that I've put the highlights on, and one thing that I continue to learn is that you do not need many highlights. One of the things that created problems for me very early on, and I continue to struggle with sometimes, is wanting to put far too many details in. And then if you put too many details in, then what happens is you lose your entire focus altogether, right? And so sometimes you have to slow down and say, look, how few brushstrokes do I have to make in order to make my point across? You know, I was fascinated by some of this light that was coming in on that area and producing a much lighter green, as you can see in the reference photo. And so I'm taking that to the nth degree to turn this into an interesting painting, full of light, full of color. Like I said, mostly lighter, warmer colors of paint as opposed to colder colors of paint, which I think gives a sense of vibrancy and life to this particular painting. Now looking at the time, of course you'll notice that a two-part video, I decided that we would break it into about an hour each, and that way it would be easier to consume the content of this one painting demo by putting it into two different videos. At this point, I'm relatively happy with this painting, and now I'm putting in the tree. So this is a mixture of burnt umber and a pool of color I already had on the palette. See how most of the tree is actually reflecting some light, and so my thought was, well, let's get a nice kind of middle brown and see what we can do with it. And then we could add some darker colors to it, some lighter colors, depending on whether it's picking up sunlight or receding into the shadows. Here, delicately pulling that whole entire branch upwards and out of the painting plane. Just strengthening the line there. Notice it's way too light at this point. It will need to have darker colors placed upon it. I'm aware of that, so I'm going to the back of my easel to get a couple of additional tools to utilize. So we're doing the palette knife to get a nice edge, taking the Ultramarine blue and Alizarin crimson to make this darker color. And I'm just kind of popping in places where the tree is actually much darker than what we're seeing. And to make sure that it catches your eye enough that you can read this shape as a tree and not something else. It's not a flagpole, it's not a telephone pole, it's a tree. And yet, I want to make it as believable as possible at this point. And so I'm just going to tap in a little bit of color to emphasize one side of that unique structure. Once again, at this point in the video, I should mention, because I hardly mentioned it all in part one, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do so. Give me a thumbs up if you would, if you like the content, and let me know if there's some things that I could change. Do you like having a reference photo always so that you can see what I'm actually looking at as I'm making the painting? Is that helpful to you? Do you like watching me mix the colors on the palette like I'm doing right now? Would you prefer some videos in which I'm adding music and fast forwarding through some of the painting process so that way it's shorter videos, more music, maybe less commentary. Do you like to see demonstrations that are in that mode? Do you much prefer the longer videos that I've been producing thus far and the voiceovers instead of a bunch of music and having to figure out things on your own? Um, would you like to I do have some videos that are reviews and specific tutorials or material guides on what to purchase to help your craft. Are those videos helpful? Have you looked at those ones on my site? How would you change anything? Always open to some feedback. I may not publicly publish all of those kind of comments, but certainly if you leave them, I will respond to you in some way and greatly appreciate the interaction that we can have. Now you see this tree on the left side of the painting panel, and I've determined that that's going to be way too light, really. It's almost as light as some of those areas in the foreground, and clearly it's not that white in the sample reference photo. So I'm taking this brush and basically wiping the paint off of it, and we'll be coming back in with a darker color of burnt umber and erase some of that mistake in terms of it looking like it's being doused in sun. There's a couple places where it's being doused by sun, but not the whole entire thing. I'm continuing to like this painting now. And so here we've got that tree in the above reference photo with some branches hanging out over. And this is real important, and you might not realize it, but this is not just adding a few little details. What this is doing is it's actually helping to direct the viewer's attention away from going off of the painting and keeping them inside of my painting. And these little branches sticking out like this in the foreground serves as a kind of gatekeeper, if you will, of keeping others out. But I'm turning it into the compositional element, keeping folks into the circle, which is the main influence here of keeping your attention in the middle part of the painting and moving you around it. Here, once again, mixing up a little bit of a different green shade. And just putting a few little leaves to indicate that these are branches that are just starting to bud. And I don't have to get fussy with them. I'm just kind of randomly putting a few strokes in here. It's always a little bit delicate and touchy when you're trying to determine how much you need. But once again, oils are pretty forgiving. I could always go back in and erase it if I didn't like it or care for it, and add something later on. Now, like so many artists, after you finish a painting, I often leave it on the easel and continue to look at it for the next couple of days. And then I will invariably add an element or two as I continue to look at the painting and make some evaluations on what it needs. In this particular case, there were a couple of additions that I put on after the video stopped taping. You will see that in the photo that's on the thumbnail that you clicked on to start watching the video, but I just wanted to make you aware of that. One of those is to add some darker tones to the tree trunk in the foreground so that there's no confusion that that is in fact a tree and not something else that we're looking at. Of course, as always, you'll have to be the judge. Does this, as you look at the reference photo and my interpretation of the reference photo, is it making sense? Now, you might notice that the river water looks a lot more brown than it does in my painting. I don't remember it looking that brown when I took the photo. But I have creative license, and I certainly am not going to put something in a painting that's going to make it less attractive and less sellable. And quite frankly, if I was to paint it the brown that I see in that reference photo, obviously not as many people are going to be excited about getting into that section of the Osage River and having fun and games, right? So I'm trying to make it look a little bit more attractive to people that are viewing it. And even though the brown water is certainly realistic in that photo, I just don't think that most people are wanting photos that, or paintings rather, that have that kind of realism. Now here's where I'm mixing the orange just from a simple combination of the cad yellow light and the alizarin crimson to further put some detail on the bank of the shore of the river. Now, this is one part too where you will not see me do this. I take a palette knife and I soften the edge of these lines in the middle area where the tree line is that you see me painting now. I just took a palette knife and flattened down a little bit of this orange color. Straightened out the shoreline just a little bit. Here I'm bringing some of that same color now to the foreground, which will produce a believability. In other words, the colors look natural. They make some other colors pop because they have red in them. If you have particular topics that you think would make a good video in the future, please leave some of those comments below as well. For example, I'm thinking of doing a Patreon page, and once I'm monetized on YouTube with the commercials, that I will set up a Patreon page which will not have commercials, and you'll be able to watch everything without interruption. And on the Patreon page, like so many artists do, there'll be different levels of support. So that way, if you'd like to help me out, maybe help me purchase some of the colors I'm using and materials for a small monthly donation, then you'd have access to all the videos commercial free on Patreon. Let me know if that would be something you would be interested in. Because at this moment I'm thinking about doing that, but if there's not a great interest, then maybe I will hold off for a while. And here we go. This is where I become aware of the fact that the tree on the left-hand side is just not dark enough. It doesn't read quite right. Or rather, you don't know how to read it because I'm unclear. So now I'm basically going back in and making it more clear by establishing this trunk that runs all the way up the side of the painting. Once again, keeping your attention from falling off or looking over to someone else's painting. A nice O pattern composition, keeping you focused on the center of my painting and looking at some of the small nuances that you see. Well, this video is almost over. You'll see me sign it pretty soon. Like I said, there's just a few little adjustments that you will notice as you see the thumbnail clip of the final version of this painting, which will make that a little bit more obvious. I just use a rubber erasing tool to basically cut back into the paint to sign my name. Here I'm just making a few small adjustments to the color before I stop. Thank you so much for watching this demonstration, and I will be producing another one soon, so stay tuned. I'll see you in the next video.